I was giving a speech in Mumbai. 15 feet away from me, in uniform, was a four-star Army general. We got talking about this promoting thing. And he said, you and I are the two top contenders for a general's promotion to general. And he said, the one thing I do above all is by hook or by crook, I go back and find the people 3 or 4 or 5 promotions ago who worked for these guys and see the degree to which they as human beings and leaders grew because of the 2 years they spent with Tom.
My guest today is Tom Peters. He's the author of many best-selling books, including In Search of Excellence, Extreme Humanism, and his newest book, which is called Tom Peters' Compact Guide to Excellence. Tom was also on the first list of 100 most powerful people in Silicon Valley from 1965 to 2000, and in 2017, he received the Thinkers50 Lifetime Achievement Award. He also served in the Navy, worked at the White House, and has a PhD from the Stanford School of Business. But most importantly, Tom Peters has a PhD in putting people first, which is what you will find on his Twitter profile if you look him up. In today's episode, Tom talks about the 2 people who most influenced who he is and why, his thoughts on Jack Welch and Elon Musk in terms of leadership, why shareholder value is the wrong way of thinking about business, and if leaders today are giving more of themselves to their people than they did years ago. There's also a bonus episode with Tom where we talk about how leaders can actually go about putting people first, how to make sure you are promoting the right people, and the role that compassion plays in business. That episode is available to subscribers of Leading the Future of Work Plus only. It is $4.99 a month or $49.99 a year. When you subscribe, you will get access to a bonus episode every week from one of my guests, ad-free listening, early access to new episodes, but most importantly, you get the opportunity to support the show so that I can bring in more amazing guests like Tom. I hope you decide to subscribe and support Leading the Future of Work Plus. One of the things that I saw, I can't remember if it was in the Guy Kawasaki interview. I think it was, but in a recent podcast, you said that there were 2 human beings, 2 most important human beings in your life. One was your mother, and the second was the first commanding officer that you had. Why your mother and why this first commanding officer? What role did they play in shaping Tom Peters?
Could we start with an easier question?
We could, but then what would be the fun in that?
But that's true. I was an only child. And the children of only children tend to very often be driven very hard by their mothers. And I was driven. I had a funny conversation. There's a guy named Alan Weber, who was a co-founder of Fast Company magazine, and I was out visiting him in Santa Fe, where he happens to be mayor now, and chatting with Alan and his wife, and we were talking about some of this stuff. And I said, well, if you want to understand me, you've got to understand that my mother was pushing me insanely by the age of 5. And Alan's wife, who I don't really know that well, looked me in the eye and she said, I bet it was more like 3. And, that may be the case. So, you could argue it's too much pushing. I'm willing to argue that, but it's turned out pretty damn well is the answer. The other thing, which is a kind of a strange thing to say, I've got an awful lot of problems with what goes on in a lot of the South, I'm sorry to say. But my mother was a Virginian, and she taught me good manners. And that is no small thing. It's really, really important. As to my first commanding officer, I've always said I got lucky. I made 2 tours to Vietnam, and incidentally, I don't know how well you know the world about 80 miles north of you, but it was in Ventura, Port Hueneme, is where I was. And I got lucky because I had 2 deployments to Vietnam, which doesn't sound like luck, and 2 commanding officers. And I have written about them and called them Captain Day and Captain Night. Whatever the first one did, I tried to copy. Whatever the second one did, I tried to run away from as fast as possible. But well, relative to the things I really care about, I was a so-called Navy CB, a combat engineer. We built stuff for the Marine Corps mainly. My first commanding officer really wanted the job to get done, and he really wanted to get it done well, and he really wanted to get it done fast. But there were 875 of us in the battalion. And I swear to God, he knew at least 871 names, which is doubtless not true, but you know what I'm trying to say. He really, really, really cared about his sailors, which didn't mean he didn't demand the best, et cetera, but it was just I learned many years later, and we can talk about this, at Hewlett-Packard about the idea of managing by wandering around. Well, my first commanding officer, not that I had a word for it or term for it then, but he was the classic MBWA guy. A lot of commanding officers, stay in their little hole underground or whatever else it is. He was always out in his Jeep, going around construction sites, checking to see how we were doing, checking to see what he could do for us to make life a little bit better for us. But it was, I said relative to the MBWA thing, which again, as I said, we can get back into. MBWA taught me that effective leadership is an intimate act, and that word is chosen with incredible care. It is about people working with people to develop each other and so on. And so that's what Captain Anderson did, basically. And my second captain, who was, and I hate to say this since I grew up in Annapolis, Maryland, was a Naval Academy grad who did everything by the books. And I was in Vietnam with a guy for a year, and I should have more than one memory. But I ended up writing the deployment report, as they called it. And I remember, and I'm an engineer, which means I couldn't spell words and things like that. I could only do 3rd-order differential equations. And so I was called into the captain's office after doing a draft. And I can still see him leaning forward and saying, Mr. Peters, which is what you call junior officers in the Navy, do you not know the difference between the word tangible and palpable? And I still don't, 50 years later. But I mean, that was the guy in a nutshell. One guy's out in the Jeep talking to his sailors. Another one is doing proofreading of a report that's not very significant anyway. But it was, it really is not as silly as it sounds to say that after I had those 2 contrasts, I knew an awful lot more about leadership than an awful lot of people do.
Do you want to learn how to create an amazing corporate culture while avoiding the pitfalls that make for a toxic one? If so, I created a brand new 8-part training video series just for you. In total, it's around 30 minutes in length, and you can get it right now by going to helpmyculture.com. Go there right now before this training series disappears forever. Again, that is helpmyculture.com, and get access to this free 8-part training series on how to create an amazing corporate culture. It reminds me a lot of, I know you're a fan of Doug Connon from Campbell Soup, and I had Frank Blake on the show as well fairly recently, the former CEO of the Home Depot. And he gave me this great quote, and he said that one of the few things that a lot of leaders don't realize is that being a leader actually means giving a piece of yourself to your people. And he said most leaders are not willing to do that. They view themselves in the role, but they forget that they actually are giving some of themselves to their people. And he shared this story where he would give up a lot of his Sunday nights, and he too would write handwritten cards to recognize a lot of his employees. And he would do hundreds of them every Sunday. And I said, Frank, why, you're giving up your Sundays here. A lot of people love their Sundays. Go relax. And he said, I have to give more of myself to my people. And that's what I choose to do. And he said, a lot of leaders today, they don't grasp that reality that leadership is hard. And that's really what it's about. So I think that ties very well into some of the stuff that you've been.
Well, you've defined perfectly in one paragraph everything that I'm concerned about, and, as you imply, my great frustration.
Yeah.
And a lot of things we can talk about, but I think one very critical part of it is who you promote into leadership positions. A guy whose name, alas, I don't remember, wrote an entire book on hiring. And he said, hiring is the single most significant thing that a company does.
Yeah.
And most people aren't very good at it. And most people haven't studied it. And my version of that is hiring and promoting are the two most significant things that are done in any organization. And relative to what we're talking about with your colleague who you interviewed, you can smell that stuff in a good interview. A couple of friends of mine wrote a book called Management Lessons from the Mayo Clinic. And every time they have one of those rankings of the great medical centers, Mayo always tends to be number one or maybe number two. And this is tiny, but I don't think it's tiny. You are one of the planet's great neurosurgeons, and you want to come to work for Mayo, and I'm the guy who's interviewing you. And so we sit down, and we have an interview, and there's something that you don't know. And I know how corny this sounds, but these guys who wrote the book, I would trust with my life. During that interview, I am literally, not figuratively, counting the number of times you use the word we and the number of times you use the word I. And if the we's lose to the I's, I don't care if you're God with a knife in your hand, you're not going to work for Mayo. Now, what's fascinating about that, and makes it not just a cute anecdote, is it goes back to Dr. Mayo in 1914, who established the idea of what he called team medicine. And this just pervades the place. And in the insanity of most healthcare institutions today, that's about as far from what goes on as one could possibly imagine.
Yeah, I like that story. That's interesting. I remember actually another we're talking about interviewing, one CEO that I interviewed, I think it was Cheryl Palmer, the CEO of Taylor Morrison. She said that she always interviews potential leadership candidates in a restaurant. And I said, well, why do you always want to go to a restaurant? And she said, because I want to see how they treat the staff. I want to see how they respond when things don't go well, if they're going to be rude to people they don't know. And I thought that was an interesting approach, right?
Who was the guy's name? I can't remember now, who wrote Swim with the Sharks, the leadership book. Do you remember that?
Yeah. I don't remember who it was, but
anyway, it doesn't matter. But it was the same thing. It was his last test, and his last test was to take the candidate out to a Minnesota Twins game and see how they behaved with the popcorn peddlers. But I think what I don't want to do is lose the thread of where we were 3 minutes ago, namely your phrase, gives of yourself.
Yeah. Because
nothing that we will say in the next 45 minutes is more important than that. That was that first commanding officer.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I'm not a psychiatrist. I don't know exactly how we define it. I think you can smell it, and I think you can see it. And the other thing you say, which is the other half of the story, so many people think the job of a leader is to sit in the office and give orders, which is total crap. I remember hearing a little story years and years ago, which I guess was true. And Joe Smith got promoted to manager, and he spent all of his time sitting in his office, kind of twiddling his thumbs. And somebody said, "Why are you doing that?" And he said, "Well, that's what my former boss did, and I thought that's what bosses were supposed to do." Now, that's silly, but it ain't really all that silly. Another way I defined it is, my wife and I used to have a home in New Zealand, and I remember I was there one North American winter, Kiwi summer, and I was walking on the beach. And it's pretty horrible to mention that when you're over 70, you're walking on the beach in New Zealand thinking about management. But I remember having this flash, and the flash took it one step further. It said, if you do not have fun doing MBWA, you should go home, sit down at your desk, and write your resignation letter. If it's not a kick, there's a woman I wrote about, I think my next to last book, who was a store manager at Nordstrom. And, Nordstrom's had some troubles, but Nordstrom were the gods of customer service and so on for a long period of time. I remember her saying in an interview, she said, when I come into the office and I've got 87 problems on my desk and I'm going through them and I really need an injection of hopefulness, she said, all I do is immediately slam the office door behind me and run out into the store and chat with people about what they're up to. And she said, without exception, I come back to my office fired up, and ready and emotionally ready to do the job. But I mean, what the hell are you and I going to do about this?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a horrible, horrible thing. You give of yourself, or you shouldn't be, leading turtles across a road, for God's sakes.
Well, do you think
I mean, one thing we could do, by the way, is hire a lot less MBAs and a lot more liberal arts majors. And we can go there if you want to. And there's a lot of evidence to support my apparently sarcastic remark.
Yeah, so I'm curious about that. But before we even jump to that, I'm curious. So if we agree that, the leader's responsibility is to give more of themselves, would you say that we're doing a better job of this now, or have we been doing a better job of this in the past? In other words, are leaders giving more of themselves today than they did before?
Well, arguably, that began to happen or is happening more. It was the blessing of the horrid pandemic at some level. You had to find ways to be in touch in this new Zooming, et cetera, world. And I would like to think that changed the dispositions of a significant number of leaders. I have no hard evidence and have done no research. But as a generic proposition, I'm not sure we're making progress, which, if you're my age, really frustrates the hell out of you. Yeah. Gallup did some research, and only 20% of workers are engaged by their job. And that number doesn't seem to change from year to year, or for that matter, from country to country. And I'm really focusing on that right now, and for not a different reason, but it strikes me that if a person was engaged and involved and giving of themselves at work, whether it's a waiter or whether it's the boss, people would be a lot less likely to go for some of the crazy theories that are driving us right out of our mind right now. But unless you were born rich, you're going to spend more of your waking hours at work than any other thing that you do as a human being, no matter how much you love your family. And I've always said, if you piss away your work life, you've literally, technically pissed away your life, because those are your waking hours.
Yep. Yeah. Well, speaking of which, I wanted to talk about two leaders who I know you're huge fans of. One is Jack Welch and the other is Elon Musk. And I know
absolutely two of the greatest human beings God has ever put on earth.
I know you love them both very dearly, and anybody who follows your tweets, especially as of late with Elon Musk, will understand. But let's start with Jack Welch. And I've interviewed a few people over the years who've worked with Jack Welch. I interviewed Jeff Immelt, who was Jack Welch's protege at GE. And, I always hear very different things depending on who I'm talking to, right? I mean, a lot of people say Jack Welch, greatest CEO, celebrity CEO, this and that. And then you talk to other people who are like, man, this guy was terrible. Where do you stand on that line, and why?
Well, your introduction suggested that I'm not their greatest fans. The flip side of that is I don't want to use one-liners. Yeah. All of us, good, bad, or indifferent, are pretty complex people. I don't remember the name of this new book that came out, but the subtitle was something like How Jack Welch Destroyed Capitalism. And that's a pretty significant charge.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's necessarily trivial. I also know that there was a book that came out, I don't know, 20 years ago.
I'm looking at it here.
I hope
Yeah.
for your own sake you didn't read it. It was called Testosterone Inc. And if you ever want to find a boys' club, I mean, the stuff that our former president did in that regard is no match for a lot of corporations. And, I think GE was amongst them. It was the ultimate boy. Some of this stuff is just, no matter what, I would never describe it in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
It was the boys' club of all boys' clubs. But there's so many dimensions. I mean, I don't know whether you remember or read the line about Welsh was when Welsh goes and visits a facility, they call it Neutron Jack.
Yep.
Like a neutron bomb. The building is still standing, but the people have all disappeared.
Yeah. And by the way, I found the book on Amazon. It's written by David Gellis, I guess. And it's called The Man Who Broke Capitalism, How Jack Welch Gutted the Heartland and Crushed the Soul of Corporate America, and How to Undo His Legacy. I actually wasn't familiar with this book. I guess it just came out a couple of months ago.
Why don't you get him on the show and tell me when it's going to be on?
Seriously, yeah, that's not a bad idea. I'm going to make a note to reach out to him.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there was the Neutron Jack thing. He got rid of bodies thoughtlessly. He did the thing which we can talk about more in some more detail. People were ranked, and the bottom, I think it was 25%, were just, thrown out on their butts from the organization. And then, thinking of your conversation with Mr. Immelt, I don't necessarily, and I'm not even suggesting it, that he did anything illegal, but boy, did he play with the books.
Yeah.
I mean, it didn't, somebody said it was more mathematically inclined than me. Over a 20-year period, the standard deviation of GE's earnings was approximately zero. They just went up in a straight or tilted line to perfection. And that doesn't happen in the real world. And relative to that, when Welsh came, and they are to some extent still today, they made appliances, they made jet engines, they made this, that, and the other. Welsh focused, I will not say almost entirely, because that's probably not fair, on GE Capital. And if you've got a financial institution like that, as we discovered in the age of the derivatives, you can make the numbers be any damn thing you want them to be. And so I think Welsh was not a great human being. And I think he was, in retrospect, a horrible role model. And I refuse to admit in a public setting like this that there was a period of time when I thought he was one of the good guys. And as I said to somebody, it's on my top 10 mistakes list. And he did have, I mean, he was a big son of a bitch, and he had the greatest Irish smile that God ever gave an Irishman. He grinned as he threw you out the door or something like that. But no, he was not, one of the good guys. And one thing we're going to do during this time, and you can set the question aside for a little bit later, is we're going to talk about Milton Friedman and shareholder value, because the two things are directly related.
I have a note to talk to you about that too.
But there was the Musk thing. I was doing my activist of active duty during the Welsh years. I don't know the intimate details of the Musk story other than what I read. I haven't been out. I haven't interviewed. I do know that I was in, I think it was the San Francisco airport not so many months ago. It's totally bizarre. As I was waiting in line, there were about 3 or 4 people talking about Musk. And there was this one woman, somebody said something, and she said, no. Somebody said, like, how did he become an asshole? And she said, no. My husband and I worked with him on his first startup. He was always an asshole. And, so I don't know how you evaluate that. I mean, here's the slight complexifier. Not as much as my wife, but I am a very avid climate change fanatic. And there is no way in the world you can disagree with the fact that Musk made the electric car part of our vocabulary. We knew what they were, we knew how to build them, but until Tesla came around, they were at the very most an asterisk. And now in the short period of, I would guess, about 8 or 9 or 10 years, I read something the other day that in 2025, GM expects more than 50% of its profits to come from its electric vehicles. So I refuse to clobber Musk on that dimension. As to his people skills, what's going on at Twitter right now is, I mean, you don't have to be a management guru, and you don't have to have ever read a management book to realize that it's just horrid human behavior. And I don't know. I mean, I was going to compare, and this is not fair on so many dimensions, Musk and Zuckerberg. I have big Zuckerberg problems too.
Yeah, it's funny because I get asked about Elon a lot as well. And like you, right? I mean, I don't know the inner workings of what's going on inside of Twitter and the details. But sometimes, I try to put myself in Musk's shoes, and here you have this person. And I can't remember another time in history, maybe you recall, where an individual like Musk actually purchased a company to become the owner of it like that. I mean, I'm not talking about like an activist, right? So it's a very, very unique situation. And I sometimes try to imagine, like, let's say I were Elon Musk and I am buying this company. And as soon as I buy it, I realize it's losing $4 million a day. And I realize like all this craziness is going on. Like, how would I respond? And I'm always left thinking like, I don't know. I don't know what I would do. Would I go in there and fire 80% of the people like on day one because I'm at that point it becomes my money? Would I, I don't know. So it's challenging because we see all these things online, and then you see some of the stuff that Musk is doing. But at the same time, it's also very easy to criticize based on what we see online without understanding the inner workings of what's going on at the company. I remember one image that was actually put up on Twitter not that long ago, where there was a picture of Elon Musk. He was doing a selfie, and he was taking pictures with engineers, and they were saying, "Oh, we're working late into the night," and he got criticized for it. And somebody was saying, "Oh, you're a dictator. You're forcing your employees to work there, and like, how dare you?" But on the flip side of that, I was thinking, well, what if those people wanted to be there? What if they are getting, they're enjoying the work, they're enjoying the challenge, they're enjoying from Elon, and they opted in to be there. And I remember even in an interview that you did, I can't remember, maybe it was with Guy, maybe it was somebody else, but you even talked about a time when you loved a job so much, or maybe it was one of your commanding officers, that you would have gladly worked 25 hours a day for this person. And so I always try to see kind of both sides there, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it, because I feel like it's so easy to.
One part, to continue with putting asterisks up, there was an article that I read just this week, and I'm afraid I don't remember the source, but it seemed to be legit, that said a lot of good guy Silicon Valley executives are quietly clapping a little bit, because when everything was going roses, when you couldn't do too much, the competition in a lot of those companies became who could find the best chef in the planet to make sure that the lunches that we were serving were the best gourmet lunches in the world. And I think that particular statement is not a joke, incidentally, because I've read a bunch of stuff about that. And so I think you could argue, and what the argument was, that even the good guys realized that in this effort to hold on to engineers or coders or what have you, we may have gone too far. So that is a little bit of an asterisk. But the question is how you do it, and what I'm going to say is a digression, but it's not. I used to be on the road all the time. I had a speakers bureau. They were called the Washington Speakers Bureau. And in theory, they're best in the country or planet or what have you. And I would go down just to check in. I was on the road, but I'd check in with him in Arlington, Virginia, Alexandria, Virginia, every 6 months or something. And I think it was after the big whack with the derivatives had happened. And they, obviously they live off of meetings of the Accountants Association where 5 speakers are needed. I mean, that's their bread and butter, and that dried up. And I was walking into the office or getting ready to, someone I know, her name is Christine Farrell, and she's the CEO of the company. And I was chatting with somebody, I don't think it was a receptionist out in the hall. And we were talking about Christine, who's a lovely person. And she said, Tom, let me tell you about Christine. She said, I walked into Christine's office one time when the worst of this was going on, and she was being vigorously hugged by the woman she had just laid off.
Wow.
And the woman she was just laid off had said, it's okay, Christine, I'm going to survive. Please don't shoot yourself. But that's a real story. And I don't think Elon should have hugged 17,000 employees. And I do agree that you can't lose $4 million a day. But you really don't have to do it that way.
There could have been a better way.
I have no truck with him whatsoever. And also, by the way, if you did spend $44 billion and it's just pocket change for you, you really don't have to fix the thing in the first 15 minutes.
Yeah.
You have to fix it to a significant degree. Of course you do. I would never disagree with that in a minute. But you don't have to do it by simply walking in and literally, lighting the fuse on a big bomb. It's disgusting.
Yeah, I agree. There could have been a better way. He could have done it in a more human, in a more people-centric way. We've heard so many terrible stories, right? I mean, there have been other CEOs who laid off hundreds of employees via Zoom. It feels like some leaders are human, and some leaders you kind of wonder.
So let's not use people-centric. I do that too. Yes, but it's a far more intimate thing than that. Yeah. It's that, not going back to the commanding officer, the person who walks down the hall and smiles and really means it. But don't effing promote those people.
Yeah.
I have argued in my writing for the last X number of years that the single greatest asset of any company is the full collection of first-line supervisors. They drive everything: retention, quality, productivity, and so on. And yet, back to promoting, we got to fill the slot. Well, you don't got to fill the slot. We need somebody who has these same attributes that you and I are apparently championing in the conversation, even more in that first level management job. And let me give you one of my favorite examples, which is fairly recent. Maybe it was before the pandemic, which means it wasn't fairly recent. But here I am, having done this stuff for 100 years, and I was blown away. I was giving a speech in Mumbai, and sitting 15 feet away from me in uniform was a 4-star Army general who apparently runs the Indian Army, which in terms of bodies is the biggest one in the world. And since I had been a junior officer in the Navy, I'm scared shitless of generals, even to this very day. But we got talking about this promoting thing. And he said, you and I are the 2 top contenders for a general's promotion to general. And you don't have to be a military person to realize a general is a big deal. He said, the one thing I do above all is, by hook or by crook, I go back and find the people 3 or 4 or 5 promotions ago who worked for these guys and see the degree to which they, as human beings and leaders, grew because of the 2 years they spent with Tom. You were X, and then you worked for Tom for 2 years. And it's not that your career flipped, but you really had a fantastic time after that. You developed people. And I'm honest to God, I almost teared up when he was saying that.
Yeah.
The measure is, and I was raised a Presbyterian, but I don't darken the church doors very often. So it's not a religious. I mean, David Brooks wrote this marvelous column a couple of years ago, 3 years ago. And in it, he contrasted what he called resume virtues and eulogy virtues. And it's pretty obvious. The resume virtues, where'd you go to college? How many times were you promoted? What's your net worth or what have you? And the eulogy virtues are what they say about you at your funeral, obviously. And at your funeral, they talk about what kind of a human being you are. And that's not a trivial point. But I mean, my life as a leader is the subsequent development of the people, whether they're first liners or bosses with whom I work. That is my signature as a human being for those 37 and a half years that I work. That's my output. My bloody output is not 7 more damn cars coming off the end of the line a year later than when I got there. That is not my output.
How do you balance that? And I guess this kind of ties into a little bit of the shareholder value, right? Because I guess as a leader, you need to balance both, right? You're also taking care of your people. You're helping them become more successful, even more successful than you've ever been. But at the same time, you're also responsible still for generating business results, for growing, for achieving whatever goals the business might have. So how do those two things play together? Are they at odds with one another, or are they related?
No, they're absolutely. We won't talk about the shareholder value. Well, yeah, let's. My old friends at the now appropriately, significantly discredited McKinsey and Company, where I worked for 7 years, did a study of something like 600 companies that, as I recall, represented 60% of the GDP. And they determined through whatever their measures were, and that's obviously something that McKinsey is fanatic about, so it can be trusted, something like 125 who, by their measures, people, training, etc., 125 who devoted themselves to people, to research, and so on. And over a 20-year period, the financial results of the good guys blew the other guys out of the ballpark. I mean, maybe because you're trying to save every penny for the first 2 years, you and I start a CEO job at the same time, and I'm the cost cutter and you're the people developer. It's entirely possible that Tom is going to do better than you for those first 2 years. But the 5-year results or the 10-year results will be laughable. And it's what I love kind of about what I do. I'm not asking you to sacrifice profits and growth. I'm asking you to maximize profit. Not tomorrow mornings, maybe, but over and not over a 20-year period, over a 2-year period, 3-year period. It made me. I didn't cut as much cost the first year as you did, and so my first year was significantly better than yours. So what?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that, because when I wrote my book on employee experience, which I think came out in, I don't know, 2016 or something, I looked at 252 companies around the world, and I looked at how do the companies that create the best employee experiences, how do they perform compared to the NASDAQ, the S&P 500, best places to work, all those different measures. And I found that the companies who create best employee experiences, which I defined as focusing on 3 areas of culture, technology, giving employees tools and resources to work effectively, and space, giving employees spaces where they actually want to show up to work each day. The companies that did that outperformed every other category of organization. So there's definitely something to be said for companies who invest in their people and the outcome that has as far as business results.
Yeah. Well, and if you're talking about national economies, what came out of the McKinsey study, and I'm sure it's true of the people you looked at, is they were the job creators.
Yeah.
The job creation record of the good guys totally. The bad guys probably had a net negative. The good guys the number sticks in my mind. The average growth of employee numbers for this 160 was something like 146%.
Yeah.
And so, there's zero sacrifice except maybe for the first 24 months. I mean, it's funny. I lived in the Bay Area and I know you were there for a while, forever and ever. And it was the days when, which some older people will remember, the 49ers were on top of the world, and they were coached by a guy by the name of Bill Walsh, who happened to be a neighbor of mine. So Bill Walsh, Hall of Fame coach, comes to the 49ers, who had just had a record of 2 wins and 14 losses. What is the record of the 49ers Walsh's first year? 2 wins and 14 losses. The next year it was 6 wins and 10 losses, and the third year they won the Super Bowl. But the reason he wrote about it in a book, and a guy who knew him and wrote about that stuff, whose name I can't remember, wrote about it. Welsh said, and this really goes to exactly what you were talking about in your work. Welsh said, I spent the first year focused on team culture. Mm. And this is guy is not a guy who's an academic with a PhD in social sciences, but it was his term. It was stuff like trivial stuff, like getting the guys to wear a coat and tie on the team bus so we would to be professional and feel professional. And maybe that's totally out of the question in 2023. And this was back in the early 80s, but and I've always loved that. Is he had a bad year and he was getting ready for great years. And I think it's an analog to what we've just talked about in the last 5 minutes.
Remember to go to helpmyculture.com if you want to get access to my brand new 8-part completely free training series on how to create an amazing corporate culture while avoiding the pitfalls that make for a toxic one. Not only will you hear from me, but you will hear from best-selling authors including Daniel Coyle, who wrote The Culture Code, and Aaron Meyer, the best-selling author of The Culture Map and No Rules Rules. You will also hear from Mark Randolph, the first CEO of Netflix, and Jim Heppelman, the CEO of PTC. Again, you can get access to all of this completely free by going to helpmyculture.com. I hope you find the video training series useful. Before we get to the last part of the podcast, where I want to focus on some action items and advice for leaders, I wanted to switch to one more personal question before we get to that, and that is, do you think about your life and legacy and kind of the outcome and what role you want to play in the world of business and in leadership? And I asked Guy Kawasaki this same question, and he said, not to be morbid, but he said, I think about death all the time. And we talked about that for a bit, and he was talking about it in the context of the impact that he wanted to have, the legacy that he wanted to have. Do you ever think about that for yourself?
I obsess on it. And I'm going to it's a serious question. I'm going to answer it seriously, but I just have to take a little bit of a detour, which actually fits. I hate the term. It wasn't my term. It was the Economist magazine of management guru. My biggest criticism of the guru class, including me, and in a way it's been implied in our conversation, is they act as if the world was the Fortune 500 and the FTSE 100. Well, it isn't. Only 7% of us work for the Fortune 500, and doing the advanced math that I learned in engineering school, that means 90% plus of us do not. And in all these arenas, there are thousands and tens of thousands of 5-person companies, 10-person companies, 40-person companies that are gifts of God relative to these things. And so we got to worry. I mean, we've got to make sure we don't just talk about the Welshes or even the good guys, the Conans. What about the person running I've tried to put them more into my book. So that's part of it. 2 things that I've said. Number one, I've got 4 degrees from Stanford and Cornell. So I've got a really terrific education. If you want to understand my work, You must show me a signed graduation certificate from the 4th grade. It ain't the technical stuff. It ain't the technical stuff. And, I really mean it. The focusing on people and so on is something driven by mom and dad and the neighbor next door to a significant degree. And in my case, it was my mother's manners, and even more than that, the elementary school I went to. I can still remember every teacher's name. We could spend the next hour talking about Miss Landers in the 1st grade and Miss Churchill in the 6th grade, and so on. And the second thing I would say is, and I would love to talk to Guy. I wish we were having a 3-way conversation. And I'm being a little sarcastic. I'm not sure how much. If Tony Robbins walks into a room of 1,000 people, he expects to change 1,000 lives. Unfair, but not totally unfair. If I go into a room of 1,000 people and 3 people come out with a real determination to go right instead of left or left instead of right, I say to myself, I have had one hell of a day. So, of course, I'm distressed. 20% of people are engaged by their jobs. 80% aren't. I haven't made a difference in that. I haven't made that damn 20. I haven't made it go up to 21, for God's sakes. And is that frustrating? Do I literally as well as figuratively want to shoot myself over that? Yeah. 2.5 million frequent flyer miles, and I haven't nudged the needle on that one. But the other side of the coin, I think I'm talking about the right things. And I think now and again, I get to people. I remember the stuff when I wrote In Search of Excellence. My thrill from In Search of Excellence was not the letters from big time CEOs. And I actually get many of those, but it was the one that came from the number 2 ranked guy in the Episcopal Diocese of New York. It was the Catholic priest who I got to know, who used In Search of Excellence for his theological PhD from the University of Notre Dame. That was the turn on. The fire chiefs, the police chiefs. Where I live right now, there's a private school, secondary school, and the first time I ever met the former headmaster, he said, I ran that school by In Search of Excellence. And so, yes, those are great things. I can look back on those with some degree of pleasure, but I must admit I'm a born pessimist, and the fact that we're still at 20% says, and I don't know what I'm allowed to say on a show like this, and so I won't say it.
You can say whatever you want, Tom.
I effed up. I didn't. If it's still 2080, I'm bullshitting myself if I say those 2 million frequent flyer miles made the world a better place. I hope I helped a few people, but I am monumentally frustrated by the whole thing. Because as I said before, if people cared about their jobs, they wouldn't be spending as much time looking at the cranks out there on social media. And I will bet you my last penny on that.
My conversation with Tom Peters continues, and you won't want to miss it, where we talk about how leaders can actually go about putting people first, how to make sure you are promoting the right people, and the role that compassion plays in business. It's $4.99 a month or $49.99 for the entire year, and for that subscription, you will get access to a bonus episode each week, early access to new episodes, and ad-free listening. Most importantly, of course, you get a chance to support the show so that I can bring in more amazing guests that you and I and everybody else can learn from. I hope you decide to subscribe and support the show, and I will see you next week.